Hi, everyone, and welcome to our session on successfully onboarding to your internship or your full-time role. My name is Sam Jones, and I'm one of the directors in the Career Management Office. And I'm really excited to have Professor Samir Nur Mohammed join us today for today's chat. So what our plan will be is Professor Nur Mohammed and I will have kind of a conversation about some of his thoughts and research about onboarding into internships and full-time. If you have any questions, put them into the chat, and then we're going to save a pretty big chunk of time towards the end to answer questions. So we're excited to hear from you and interact with you. So Samir, it's great to have you again.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Sam. Just by way of preview, this was going to be me just showing a PowerPoint on Zoom, but we figured we've had enough of those by this point in the year, so it'd be better to do something a little bit more dynamic. I hope it can be a little bit more interactive. So I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Fantastic. Me too. And just by way of quick introduction, you are a faculty member in the management department, focusing a lot of your research on topics like motivation, being an underdog, and this process of onboarding as well, which is super interesting. And I know that you teach both the 610 class and your Power in Politics class. So I know you're just a wealth of information, and we had the opportunity to interview you on our MBA Career Management podcast. So we really kind of view this as part two of getting to know you and some of your thoughts about onboarding. So thanks again for joining us.
Absolutely, and it's great to see some of the former students here too.
Absolutely. Well, I know that last time we talked, the three topics that you were really passionate about were feedback seeking, power in politics, and the imposter syndrome. So what would you think if we just start there and hear some more of your thoughts on these topics as they relate to onboarding?
Absolutely. Sure.
Sounds good. Where do you want to start?
You choose.
Why don't we start with power in politics, since I know that's what you're teaching now?
Absolutely.
So how should interns or people going full-time to a new role think about power in politics in the new organization?
So it's funny when, just thinking about the topic of power, we have a guest speaker coming into our course tomorrow, and he's pretty senior, well, not only is a CEO, is a president of a company. So talk about someone with power in an organization. And even he himself doesn't view himself as having much power, right? He thinks power is very ephemeral. Even if you have it, it doesn't always operate in the way that you expect. And I think even if you're going into a company as an intern, you may not think you have any power at all, but you actually have more power than you think. So there's research showing that we constantly underestimate the influence that we think we have over others. As someone going into a company for the first time, you may not have as high of a position as others, but you actually do bring certain skills to the table that are really valuable. And you also have, I think more importantly, an opportunity to develop relationships that others can't in the organization. So if you especially kind of move beyond thinking about your internship as just a job, but just as part of a wider career path, I think that's very valuable. So I think when people think about the topic of power, and I asked this question on the first day of my course, do you see it as a force for good or bad in your organization? A lot of people immediately say it's bad, right? Especially MBA students. That's not partially what motivates many of them to join the course, right? They've been on the receiving end of it, or they've seen it happen in the organization where politics, has a destructive impact on someone's career. But I think what's really important to highlight when we think about power is that it actually is something that we can use to change a system or institution or organization that hasn't improved for a long period of time. If we actually want to create change in an organization, you have to use power in some way. Now, power can come in many different forms, and it's up to the person using it to decide which type of power they want to exercise. But it's something that needs to be used often to change how things are done in organizations, and I think that's really valuable and very important.
That's fantastic. What do you mean by power?
So the definition of power is a hard one to nail down because there's so many different perspectives. So if you take, someone like Aristotle, who wrote about this topic,
you're going really far back.
Pretty far back, or further back than, at least I go in terms of age. He talked about it as something that looked more like influence, something that wasn't zero sum. He thought virtue was the key to influence and power. So, living a good life, being honorable, these virtues were really widely respected, and that's how someone built up their power. And it wasn't just about logic, but a person's character that lended someone power. You fast forward to Machiavelli, he spoke about power in The Prince. And that's a very different approach to power, right? It's a approach to power that's much more zero sum. Power is something to be taken, something to be grabbed. Someone may have power, but you can take it for yourself. Mm-hmm. So those are historical perspectives on it. I like to think of it, at least in terms of the research, you can categorize it in one of two categories. One is, it's the process of outcome control. So it's controlling events, right? Controlling outcomes, controlling resources. Other people think about it in terms of a process for influence. So it's a way of getting to an outcome. It's a way of mobilizing energy towards a decision. It's a way of persuasion. I don't think we're all going to agree on the definition, but what I always outline to my students is that regardless of how you define power, other people may define it differently. And if they define it differently, that has implications for you, because they may believe some things are more acceptable to behave in a certain way than you do. So if I think power is zero sum and something to be taken and you don't, well, I might take the power if you're going to just let me, right? So that's kind of how we treat it in the course.
So it sounds like part of it is thinking about power as a way to improve systems that you're part of. And part of it is understanding that different people view power differently. So it's important to know how people around you view power.
Absolutely. And it can be obviously be used to improve systems. It can be used for self-interest, or it can be used for collective interest. Mm-hmm. And sometimes we're part of that collective, sometimes we're not. Yeah. The other thing that we highlight in the course is, and I think this is valuable to think about in reference to, internships, for instance, is that your position is only one source of your power. So in the course, we also talk about this idea of the personal power that you have, everything from your education, your skills, your background, your experience. Those things matter. Obviously, the tactics you use, so it's influence tactics, for instance, so your emotional appeals versus logic, those have differential effects. But then, of course, your relationships as well. So who are your strong ties? Who are your weak ties? Where can you fill a structural hole? These are, I'm putting these concepts into the air because I know everyone here took Management 610 and remembers all of them perfectly well. If you don't remember perfectly well, of course you took notes, but these things are important too for thinking about power, especially if you're not walking into the company in a very senior position. These sources of personal and relational power are going to be very valuable for developing your influence within a company.
That's really helpful. I had an intern once who was at a tech company, and he had a great relationship with his manager. At the end of the summer, he presented his final project. He thought he was going to get a full-time offer. His manager planned to give him a full-time offer, and the committee that reviewed his project decided to not give him an offer. And he was very shocked by that. And what he found out later, related to what you're talking about with power, is that his manager's peers hated that project. They hated that idea. They didn't want it to be going forward. And he was really unaware of that context. So how would your framework speak to a situation like that? What could he have known going in?
Yeah. So one of the things we do in the course is, it's a very simple exercise. There's many different ways to depict networks. So, sociologists and computer scientists, they do these nice fancy network analyses that are 2D, but then you can make them into 3D models. They're really, really cool. But the simple exercise that I encourage students to do, and would encourage many people here to do, is to do what I call a relational power audit. And the way it works is you write down the names. So let's say you're going to your internship this summer. Write down all the names of the people that you're going to interact with. You're not going to have a comprehensive list, but just write down the names that come to mind. And if you look at this really instrumentally, you, next to those names, put a column of how much each of those people depends on you. Okay. And the column next to that, put a column of how much you depend on those people. And for people that are going into companies as interns, that there's going to probably be a deficit there, right? Because not surprisingly, you depend on them much more right now than they depend on you. You're new to the company. But then one of the things we find out from the research, though, is that, the relationships that kind of work out the best, the relationships that give us energy, they're not ones that are imbalanced in one way or the other. It's not ones where I depend on you the most or you depend on me. it's also not ones where we depend on each other very little. It's the ones that we depend on each other a lot. So you depend on me and I depend on you. Those are the relationships that tend to give us energy. Those are the relationships that we tend to go back to. Those are the people that we tend to go to for advice. So kind of thinking back to this example that you're giving, Sam, like it occurs to me probably that, this person that you're speaking about probably didn't have a full picture of all those stakeholders that really mattered in that audit. And that's something that we all make mistakes about right? We only focus on those that are closest to us. We focus on, for instance, in the vernacular of networks, on our strongest ties, but we forget that there are all these other people that might be important to the decision. And if you do that decision making, this relational power audit, you might come across those people and you might remind yourselves that, I should go follow up with that person on the project, or I should get coffee with that person, or I don't know that person, but I know, Aditi in the organization who knows that person and she can make the connection. And that can be really valuable for kind of building up your relational power, building up your network. And though this is most useful and effective when you're doing it constantly and you're doing it proactively. You're not doing it reactively and you're not doing it at the last second. Mm-hmm. No one likes the person, right, that comes in at the last minute and is clearly asking for a favor, and then never follows up with you again. Like no one really likes that person. If you think about warmth, which is a fundamental dimension of person perception. Mm-hmm. So if you're doing this, the people that are doing this well, they're people that are looking for opportunities. They're, providing resources to people way before they need to lean on that person at all. So I think that exercise is really helpful and really valuable. And the good thing is that we all can do it. We don't need a fancy computer program to do it. We can simply just create a table, 3 columns. Well, 4 columns. Name, how much you depend on that person, how much that person depends on me, and then a plus or minus of the difference between those columns 2 and 3, and go through that. And if you see, there are these huge deficits, think about how can I proactively provide resources to these people? How can I make it so that I'm not so dependent on that person? And if someone's really dependent on me, well, think about ways that you can make that relationship a little bit more enriching for them. How can they contribute to you or contribute to people that work with you, for instance? So looking to kind of, increase that mutual dependence is valuable.
That's so great. I love how practical and actionable that is. You can really go into an organization that you're a part of as a new person and think about the relationships, the power, the giving to one another, and really proactively going in and establishing these productive kind of contributing relationships. So
it's funny you bring that up. I like to say that I teach a full service course. You can use this in your internships. You can use this in your personal relationships. You can use it wherever. I leave it to students to decide where they want to use it. But yeah, this is something, I know of a student from many moons ago here at Wharton who was an MBA who literally did this in a spreadsheet. Mm-hmm. Like they kept track of this. And this sounds, I know to some people it sounds so dirty, and I'm not saying that this is the approach that you should use, but it's something that you can just think about. If there are people doing this, so constantly, you deserve to do this for yourself once or twice, a year, let's say, or maybe once every quarter. It really helps you identify gaps in your network.
I love that. It's really helpful. Let's pivot to feedback. How do you encourage people who are onboarding to a new job? Could be interns, could be full-time, it could be once our students become alumni and are changing jobs. How to use feedback as a tool for understanding how others perceive them, as a tool for onboarding effectively into an organization.
Yeah, so it's interesting. There was a long period of time in research where people saw feedback as a one-way exchange, right? So managers are giving me feedback, and we're way past that day when we saw things that way. But it was a really big insight for research when they started saying, well, actually, I can seek feedback myself. I don't have to wait for my manager. I don't have to wait for my coworkers. I can find opportunities for myself to do it. And feedback seeking tends to be pretty effective for performance. The literature is becoming more and more clear that it's a positive force for kind of improving your performance over time. There are two main categories of doing it. One is to simply ask questions and ask for it directly, right? So, I did this assignment for you, Sam. How did I do? Where can I improve? What are some gaps? Who should I speak to? That's one way of doing it, and that's actually really effective.
Mm-hmm.
The other way of doing it is to literally observe, to watch others. So, Herminia Barra, who's a faculty member at London Business School and was at INSEAD before, she has this idea of kind of putting on different hats when you walk into the company. So I walk into the company and, maybe Jerry isn't very much like me, but Salima is like me. And I see elements of the way she exercises power and influence, or maybe her background kind of resembles mine. So I'll kind of put on the Salima hat and I'll try and act that way. I'll adopt some of those behaviors. I'll talk to people in her network. And we do this naturally. We try to find role models in the organization that kind of serve as prototypes, and we're trying on these different hats. And so the whole reason why I bring this up is kind of circling back to the point is we can observe others, we can monitor others. That's a way for gaining feedback because it tells us what's normative around here, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, right? So if I see everyone in my company sending out emails at 9 p.m., chances are maybe you should be sending out an email at 9 p.m. Or maybe you should schedule an email to send out at 9 p.m., right? So draft that email at 5 p.m., but send it at 9 p.m. That's normative. That's acceptable. So this observation is really important. It's a way of acquiring knowledge. It's a way to learn in organizations. And that's the whole idea behind feedback. It's a way to learn. The other side of feedback, though, is impression management, right? It's a way to show that you're engaged, you're interested, you want to learn, you want to get better. If I were to go back to those two forms of feedback that I spoke about earlier, directly asking questions versus observing, people don't always notice the observing. We may notice that we're observing, but you can't tell that I'm always observing unless you're noticing every little thing I do, or I make a comment about it, how I saw, Salima doing this thing and how that's improved my performance or whatever it is. So what they find in the feedback literature is that for actually improving performance evaluations, whether it's actual performance evaluations, but for improving performance evaluation, we have to do more of the inquiry. We have to do more of the asking. That's actually what's really valuable, probably because that gets us direct answers to our questions, probably also because it offers us some impression management at the company, and it manages how people see us. It shows that we're engaged. It shows that we're kind of good soldiers for the company. So that's something that I think as an employee going in, you want to do both. You want to do the inquiry and you want to do the monitoring and observing, but make sure that inquiry is happening more vocally, right? You really, and you got to figure out, okay, well, who do I ask for what kinds of information? But probably better to veer on doing more of it rather than less of it, especially at the beginning.
That's super helpful. It's just, I see like a 2-box framework where one side is being very proactive, inquiry, the other is observing, and we can all go into a new environment thinking about that. I know you and I have had some talks before about goals.
And sorry, Sam, just on that point, that I think I like that too, because this whole idea of being proactive, like it's the same thing. The people that tend to have a more proactive disposition tend to do better in organizations in most places. I mean, more generally across organizations. So again, this proactivity is something that tends to be rewarded across companies. We see that come up in the data time and time again.
Great. That's a great point to add in.
Yeah.
I was thinking about some of the conversations in the past we've had about goal setting and how people can have mastery goals where they're mastering skills, and they can have achievement goals where they're seeking to accomplish something. And I was thinking about somebody onboarding, having both of those goals. They're seeking to redefine maybe their skills or refine their skills, learn new things, at the same time achieve something. How would you bring feedback into those two goals as someone's onboarding?
Feedback in terms of like the feedback seeking?
Yeah, feedback so that someone can develop mastery, develop their skills further in the new organizational context, and feedback where they can know, is their project on target? Are they achieving what they need to be achieving?
Yeah, so it's interesting you bring this up, Sam, because I think you'll recall I'm not the biggest fan of the goal setting literature. I think it's valuable, but I'm not the largest fan. So of course you had to ask me a goal setting question. So kind of thinking about it's interesting, right? So like if you take the point that I brought up just a few moments ago about seeking feedback, some people are doing it truly for mastery and for learning, right? Some people are doing it to make sure they perform better than others, right? they're doing it to make sure that they get the next promotion, to make sure that they secure the next job offer. I don't think we're always good at really inferring why someone is seeking feedback, for instance. But you see companies do this in all sorts of ways. I think there are ways that companies give out, feedback, but it lines up a little bit more with the performance side. You see this in terms of rankings and social comparisons. There's all sorts of ways in which, companies are gamifying performance, right? There's there was just an episode on The Daily last week on Amazon. The apps that are used in that organization that some would argue, are really means of control in an organization, but some ways they're trying to gamify it in some ways, right? Like, this is your productivity. Maybe if they made a more Peloton based version of the app, it would go down a little bit better, right? So I think there's that element of it. In terms of the learning and mastery, I think the way that I would really think about this distinction is, with performance, the comparisons between you and someone else, right? Whereas with learning and mastery, it's between me today versus me yesterday, and versus where I'm going tomorrow. And I think if you're focusing on learning and mastery, and that's truly what you're interested in, you're not prompting the social comparisons in the same way with other people. You're focusing on how are you doing today versus how are you doing yesterday, and where are you going forward tomorrow. And I think that helps people because it doesn't distract them from the learning and mastery. I think the second that you heighten, the rankings with other people, it does make people, especially those that are more sensitive to social comparisons towards others. They're even if the intention is to make it focused on learning and mastery, their focus starts deviating and it goes towards more of the performance mindset. So I think if you're someone that's truly, interested in improving, asking for feedback based on, how you were doing 2 weeks versus a month ago can be really valuable. Also using it to basically, how can I do better going into the future? That's very valuable. And it's making very clear to the person you're asking feedback from the purposes of the feedback. You're not just doing it for, the purposes of getting a promotion. You're doing it for the purposes of learning, for getting better at what you do. And I think most people support that goal in an organization.
That's fantastic. I really like that as a very actionable, concrete step as well, that somebody can disclose to the person they're asking feedback to the motive behind it. And as it's aligned to mastery and growth, others are likely very supportive of that.
And kind of tying it into, some of the earlier points is, I told you about that relational power audit we did. Think about who you're seeking feedback from, right? So if you're seeking feedback only from the people that are directly evaluating you, that's very different than someone who's seeking feedback from multiple people, even those that aren't directly involved in evaluating you or making a decision on this project. I don't have data around this, but I imagine that those that are focused more on learning and mastery, they're probably seeking more of that diversity of opinion type of feedback from multiple people, even when they're not directly involved with evaluation of yourself, because they truly want to get better. So that's another heuristic, a concrete heuristic that people can use, which is, if you want to get better from the perspective of learning and mastery, well, think about who you're seeking feedback from. I'm not saying you have to implement everyone's feedback. I'm saying simply asking, well, who are you going to? And the nice side benefit of doing this is that you're building up your relational power. You're building up your networks. You're talking to those people that otherwise you wouldn't be interacting with. And that could be really valuable for not only your specific project or what you're working on getting better, but also thinking about building your connections so that, maybe you find out that actually there's another team that I want to work on in the future, or when I start the job, or maybe this is, that team has the type of people I want to work with. So that could be valuable as well.
Fantastic.
I see a question in chat. How seriously should one take feedback from people you don't necessarily work with / are adjacent to on work streams? I don't know. That's a good question. Like it largely depends. Like, there's so many contingencies to a question like this, right? Like, is the person involved with, are they familiar with their project? Do they have a good understanding of it? Do they understand the scope? Do they want to see it do well? I speak to my wife about her work, constantly, and, she'll tell me, she's been working on this project for 2 months. She does a presentation. They say, great, like, go present it to this other group that hasn't thought about the project at all. gives feedback on it, and she's thought about all these things, but how do you weigh that feedback? Like, she's thought through a lot of those things, but you've got to somehow incorporate it into your presentation, right? So I think thinking about, even if you're not taking it seriously, you've got to show that you're adaptable to it, you're flexible to it. I think that's still going to give off an impression.
Mm-hmm. Part of the impression management you're referring
part of the impression management. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Let's I know another question or topic that you're really passionate about is this concept of being an underdog.
Yeah.
And if people want to learn about the history of your feelings about being an underdog, they can listen to our first interview. You had a great story about that. But tell us a little bit about this concept of being an underdog and how that plays out for people as they're starting a job.
Yeah, so it's kind of one of the reasons why I'm interested in the topic of power and why I teach it. I don't teach the course. If you take the course at other schools, it's really much centered around having power and what you do when you have power. And what I'm just as interested in what you do when you don't have power, essentially, right? How do you build it up, but also how do you respond to those that have power and power over you in some instances? So a lot of where this research comes from, it comes from this idea, which is one of the most pervasive and important research findings, I would argue. It's the self-fulfilling prophecy. It's also called the Pygmalion effect. It's this idea that high expectations are really good for performance. So when people expect us to do well, they're more likely to invest in us. We also feel more confident as a result, and we tend to perform better. And a lot of the research basically shows this across a number of settings, whether it's in the military, in educational settings, and manufacturing plants, that if our supervisors expect us to do well, we expect to do better ourselves and we perform better. And likewise, on the flip side, people don't expect us to do well, we don't have confidence in ourselves and we perform poorly. And one of the reasons why I kind of got interested in this research is this idea, well, why if that's the case, then why do people sometimes still persist when others say that you can't do something? Like that was really the kernel of a question that I had. And you can think of countless examples. You have the stories of, the biblical story of David versus Goliath. You have stories in sports. You have stories in politics where this happens. It seems like every week there's a new underdog story, of course. So I really became interested in this question for that reason. And was interested, well, why are people motivated in these circumstances and how do they perform better and when will they perform better? And one of the things that came across from my research was basically that when you're not expected to do well by others, you don't always just simply quit. You don't always tap out. Some people are indeed motivated. And one of the main reasons why they're motivated, it's not the only reason, but one of the main reasons why they're motivated is that they want to prove those people wrong, right? So someone that says that you can't do something, sometimes you'll do exactly what the self-fulfilling prophecy says, which you might say, well, that person really knows what they're talking about. I don't feel confident in myself and I'll perform worse. But sometimes you might say, well, that person doesn't know what they're talking about. I want to show them that I can actually do this. So across the series of studies, I kind of show that actually people can perform well in the face of these underdog expectations from others. And why that happens is this desire to prove others wrong. But the question is, well, when does it happen? When do you kind of get motivated versus when are you less motivated and tap out? And kind of what it came down to in my research is showing the credibility of the observers, the people that are evaluating us, the people that are giving those expectations on whether we'll do well or not. So kind of the theory that, I was leaning on and would have predicted that, if someone's really credible, I'm going to internalize that expectation and I will perform worse when I'm an underdog. Versus if someone's not so credible, I will be motivated to prove them wrong because I don't believe them and I will perform better as a result. And that's kind of what we found in the research, but there was this funny twist that it turned out that even people who were more getting underdog expectations from those who were more credible, they still wanted to prove others wrong. But the reasons why they performed worse was because they experienced a sense of pressure and anxiety from those expectations. So even though, you could be the smartest person in the world and tell me that, Samir, you can't do this. I might want to prove that person wrong, but that expectation of trying to prove them wrong, it creates too much pressure for me. And as a result, I perform worse.
Got it. So it sounds like your ability to regulate that pressure how you cognitively reappraise that evaluation of you is really important.
It's probably vital to it. Yeah. And there's some stuff looking at how, so Alison Wood Brooks, who's actually used to be a doctoral student here at Wharton, now is a faculty member at Harvard. She has a cool study looking at, how do we deal with anxiety? And she kind of shows that people who reframe anxiety as excitement. So if you think about she does it in like cool settings such as like public speaking or even like American Idol competitions. The people that can reappraise that anxiety as excitement, they tend to do better because excitement's almost like a high activation emotion. So we can kind of reframe that emotion of anxiety to excitement quite well. So there are things that we can actually do. So to kind of thinking about this in the context of interns, you're walking into your job on day one. I'm sure you're feeling a little bit anxious about the impressions you'll make. Think about the ways that, this job is providing you an opportunity, the exciting connections you're going to build, the skills that you're going to learn. Trying to reappraise that anxiety as excitement might be valuable for you.
Super helpful. All right, well, if there's nothing else it's like burning inside of you to say about underdogs, there's two more topics I want to cover.
Yeah.
And then
so
more questions.
I saw this question from, I think, Ming in chat, it's a good question. Doesn't asking for feedback somewhat build up the deficit between how much you depend on someone? How should we think about balancing getting enough feedback versus overwhelming those that provide it to us? So it's actually related to some of the work that Alison Wood Brooks is doing. So what she finds, so one is that this is an egocentric bias that we have. We think that by asking for feedback, we're imposing on others. That's not always the case. People are actually genuinely quite helpful and they want to actually see you do well. The second thing is it depends on how we frame our feedback. So one of the things that some of the research is showing is that when we frame our feedback, asking for feedback as asking for advice, people are really flattered. And they don't see that as something like you're doing impression management and stuff. They're seeing it as a genuine request where you're looking to do better. And people feel good when you're asking them for advice. So actually reframing that as advice seeking, essentially. So Sam, I know you've been you used to work on this project. It's an area that I took over. Like, what would be your advice to me? That builds up flattery. It doesn't build up a deficit. Actually, what will happen is Sam will actually have a more favorable perception of me if you kind of frame it as advice. So that'd be something to kind of answer Ming's question.
That's great. So it could actually be the opposite. It's that your asking is building a deficit in the other direction.
It could, yeah. It's like I'm not docking you in the same way, and it's actually I like you in more sense because you came to me to ask for advice rather than going to someone else.
Yeah. Something that I've implicitly picked up in our conversation about feedback is it seems like the examples you give are all like verbally asking for it as opposed to writing and asking for it. Do you have any thoughts on which is better?
I don't have good research data, so I will not speak on the topic.
All right. I like what you're saying.
What are your thoughts on it? Do you think one would be more effective than the other?
I love that you're staying on brand with and things.
We're a research-based school. We don't know. Not allowed to give my opinions. Can only go based on research.
So I would say the same thing. I don't have any empirical data on it. One thing that I come back to is kind of the nature of that relationship. If you've had a lot of email exchange, then maybe it would be appropriate. If you have more FaceTime with that person, maybe it would be appropriate. So I would try to bring it into the context of the communication that you are already established with that person.
Yeah, the other thing that this brings up, and this is not on brand in terms of research-based advice, but it does follow a tenet that you learned way back in third grade, which is ask three before me. And I can't tell you, I would love a study that actually looked at that, right? If you have a question before you ask your manager, well, saying I asked, these two coworkers didn't have an answer, they gave me these answers, but wanted to get your thoughts. That's going to probably go over much better than just simply going to your manager for every single request. So no data to back up that assertion, but I do trust my third grade teacher quite a bit. So I think she was onto something there.
Well, her early investments in you have propelled you to a great career. So I'm sure.
It's good. I liked my third grade teacher.
All right. Well, two more topics I was interested in asking you about. One is diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then the other is I know you did some research last year with Wharton students. So I want to tap into that too.
Okay, cool.
But as you think about people of color, people who come from marginalized communities entering into organizations that are maybe more aligned to what we would consider like a majority culture in the industry or in the US. Do you have any unique advice for these individuals to think about?
Yeah, so this is an area that's obviously receiving more and more research attention, which I think is really important. So one of the common, I'll bring up one of the common things that I hear in my course, and even in interviews and talking to people in companies, and even former students. I'm bringing back some of my former students into my course this year to do these guest sessions, which is kind of cool. But one of the things that people will say when they're from non-majority groups, they'll often say, well, I need to find a mentor who's a lot like me, right? Who went through similar experiences, can really show me how to navigate the organization. And it's really important to have someone like that on your side. And I think it's a very important point. And the unfortunate thing is that companies don't always have great representation, obviously, especially if you're joining, a smaller organization. So I think it's important to think about, the intersectionality of all my different identities that I have, rather than just looking at through the lens of one particular one. The other thing that I'd say is that I think a lot of times some of these things that we line up are false choices. So for instance, I was having a conversation with someone the other day about, representation and diversity in organizations. Should we have, more people in the top ranks that, are from underrepresented backgrounds, or should we have more majority group members like white men speaking up on, racial issues and so forth? And it's a false choice. It's not an either or. I mean, this idea of everything being zero sum it's not the way it has to be. There's ways to think about these things in terms of we need both. We know from the research, we know it's important to have representation. That's like abundantly clear. But also some of the research by David Heckman and Stephanie Johnson and others shows that the people least likely to get penalized for speaking about diversity issues in the workplace are white men. They're majority group members. So to deny their role in creating changes, it's not accurate with the data. I think that's one. And two is I don't think it's great for getting them involved. And I think it reduces their psychological standing, which we know is a barrier to these issues. And psychological standing is very valuable. Mm-hmm. So kind of going back to your question, if you're entering an organization as someone who's, part of an underrepresented group, yeah, they're probably going to be ERGs, employee resource groups that you can join that kind of speak to your background, that speak to your experiences, that can tell you, the ways to navigate certain things in the organization. But there are also other initiatives in the company, and I wouldn't say just get involved with one. Try out a couple of those different hats, kind of like Herminia Arbara says, right? Go to some of those other things where you share a common interest, because those can be a great way of building up your networks as well. So I think it is important to remember that a lot of the challenges that people face when they're not from majority groups is that they don't have, they don't get the same access to career development, because they don't have the same networks, and they don't have the same, they're not apprised of the same knowledge as everyone else. They don't always get the same emotional support because people aren't coming from the same backgrounds. So they don't know why they're reacting a particular way, which is like the most egregious thing to say to someone, of course. But also there aren't always role models. So I'd say when you're joining an organization, you want to look for mentors, but look for mentors in a way that, can think about it, the ways that they can broaden your knowledge or your network in some way, and someone that's willing to advocate on your behalf. And if you're looking on those two dimensions, it's not going to be limited simply to who shares the exact same background as me. So that's where I've kind of paused on that.
Very helpful. Very helpful. Like I hear you saying, like, looking for people who, I like the phrase, like, can expand your knowledge and network, and then who are motivated to want to help you.
Yeah. I had Edie Hunt come in from Goldman many moons ago in my course, and she described this program that they did at Goldman to really try to increase representation. Now, I know every organization struggles with it. I'm not putting this up as a paragon of a role model in an industry, but it was an interesting program where what they had was they had managers basically they basically had a scarce resource of this, a prestigious program that they created for people that that were from underrepresented backgrounds, where, they would get access to certain resources and so forth that other people wouldn't have in the organization. And they really elevated the program so that managers were arguing over whether their person could go in and join that organization, join this program, essentially, right? So you had a situation where if I have someone working for me, I think they're high potential, coming from an underrepresented group, I would basically be saying, you know what? No, David, my person should be going. And then David would make the reasons why their person should be going. And they tried to create enough room so that all these people could get access. But trying to make it scarce, right? A scarce opportunity was really, really valuable. And some of the research on influence says the same thing. So Bob Cialdini talks about how, a scarce resource or a scarce opportunity, it leads people to want it more. And I think that's such an important thing to remember as we think about some of these issues and topics, is how can we apply some of these principles from the influence and power literature and migrate them into spaces such as D&I. Not all of them will work. Some of them won't work well at all. Some of them will backfire, but some of them have the potential to work. And I always thought Edie's example was a great example of how scarcity can actually persuade people more, rather than just making the opportunities available to everyone. So yeah.
Very helpful. I wasn't aware of that. That's super interesting way to think about that programmatically.
Yeah.
All right, last topic I have for you, and then we'll open it up to the crew that's with us. I know that last year you conducted some research with Wharton MBAs, undergrads, and some Penn graduating students as well about their experiences transitioning into the workforce. And you're still in the process of analyzing this data. But what have you learned from the data that you have?
Yeah, so it's a pretty cool study, because we had this idea that we wanted to investigate these particular topics. We were ready to do the study, and then there was this thing that happened. It was called like COVID-19. I don't know what that was, right? But it totally sidetracked us, where you had to reorient, around obviously COVID and everything taking place. And we wanted to just get a sense of how people were handling it, coping with it. So we surveyed people at 3 different time points. So we surveyed them in April, kind of before they graduated, and May after they graduated. And then we surveyed them in November and December. So after they've started their jobs. So we're in the process of analyzing that data. But there's some interesting things that we saw in the data. So just as a way of preview. So there were a couple things. So one is, we talked a little bit about feedback seeking earlier. Not surprisingly, I'd say, is that people that, tended to seek more feedback, they tended to be people with more engagement on their job and having a strong desire to learn. So those were 2 things that we saw in our data. So now we're trying to tease apart, well, does engagement lead to more feedback seeking, or does more feedback seeking lead to engagement? Probably goes both ways in some ways. And also, not surprisingly, but this is something that I think that really articulates this knowing and doing gap that I know our students heard about in Management 610. We know this stuff, but we still don't implement it. We found in our data that people that were feeling very lonely or burnt out, they were the most likely not to seek feedback in their organizations. And that was people that were lonely or burnt out way back in April and May. And then this is on their job in December, right? So I think that's just something to keep in mind, know that you're not alone in these struggles, right? And try to figure out ways, maybe systems and processes, maybe having someone that keeps you accountable, so that you're not missing out on opportunities. So that was one of the interesting things we saw with regards to feedback seeking. The other thing that we're starting to unpack is this idea between different career paths. And the idea is that some career paths are, more linear than others. So you go into consulting, for instance, it's very sequential.
I've heard.
Are there people at Wharton that do go into consulting? I've never heard of consulting. No, but yeah, it's a very sequential career. Like, you do the internship, you go into the organization. There are these clear milestones that you're trying to hit. And a lot of professions have it. It's not just consulting. Lawyers have the same thing, for instance. So one of the things we saw is that, actually, interestingly enough, the people that were in sequential careers actually were experiencing less burnout, less sadness, and less fear in their jobs. Now, it's interesting because you think in some of these careers like consulting, like those people maybe experience a lot of burnout from some of the things that they have to do in their job. But we think one of the reasons for this, and we're starting to unpack it a little bit more, is because it's a very clear what they need to do next, right? It's like clear what I'm going for. And that is kind of speaking to, you love goal setting, Sam. So I'll give it to you on this one, right? But that lack of ambiguity around the goals, I think is probably the reason why we're observing this in some ways. So it's something that we're trying to unpack a bit further too. So it makes me wonder, okay, so if I'm not going down a sequential, clear career path, those are going to present me challenges, and trying to kind of anticipate some of those challenges, who to seek out, how to build out my networks, going to career services and so forth. That might be important to do. The other thing that I wanted to do, Sam, though, was like, it's like, why do we do some of these studies in the first place? Like, what do we learn? So sometimes we learn things that are totally obvious. Sometimes we learn things that are less obvious. So I thought what we'd do is, let me give you a little bit of trivia from our data. So I'm going to ask you a couple questions. And I'm going to see if you can guess. You, do you
mean like the plural you? Or
it could be, if there are people here, I know there aren't many people on video, but I can see you through your screen. Yeah. No, I'm kidding. If you want to, actually, if anyone in the audience wants to respond on chat, feel free to do it as we go through. Okay. But I'll let you be the representative of the group. But maybe you can do like Who Wants to Be a Millionaire style and ask for audience input as we go along.
Sounds good.
It's just, all right. Yeah. A couple people coming off muted video. I love it. So a couple trivia questions from our latest survey initiative. So let me ask you the first one. Which of the following services from career services were students most satisfied with, Sam? Option A, assistance filling out job applications. Option B, resume preparation and revision. Option C, assistance networking with potential employers. And option D, interview preparation. Which one do you think you want?
It's a little tricky for me because I know that 50% of your data came from undergraduate career services. And I actually don't know how the students would answer it, but interview prep, I think, would be a strong driver for our MBAs.
All right. I'm going to ask a few of the people that are off mute video. Ming, Kristen, Allison, Todd. Any guesses? You want to chime in too with your guesses? Think Sam's right?
Perhaps networking with employers.
Okay. Anyone else want to guess?
I like the interviewing. I'm going interview for the win.
Going with Sam. Allison, Ming, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I'm also specifically interviewing with Sam.
I like networking.
You like networking. All right. Maybe. So Sam, actually the correct answer was B, resume preparation and revision. Oh. Now, maybe I got to go back to the data though. Maybe it's due to the undergrads pulling up the data in that way. So they were most satisfied with resume preparation / revision, and then with assistance networking with potential employers, then with interview preparation, and then assistance filling out job applications. That doesn't mean you should be doing all of these things. Yeah. It's just what are they most satisfied with.
Did you run an ANOVA on these, or are these just like simple?
Sam, you're getting into the details. We're supposed to stay high level. Okay. This is simple correlations. We're doing simple correlations right here. Well, we'll let you do the regression, Sam. All right. I like this trivia question. Actually, we'll probably end with this one. What was the most commonly reported job or internship disruption caused by COVID-19? A, deferred start date. B, earlier start date. C, transferred to a different department. D, shortened internship. Or E, reduced compensation.
I think I know the answer to that.
All right, tell me.
I think for the MBAs, it's shortened internships because all of the investment bankers, which is a really big population, have that.
Okay. Anyone else want to guess?
I'll say
this is actually mostly with people that had full-time jobs, so I should know that.
Oh, it is. Okay. Yeah. It might be the deferred start date then.
We got a couple of people in chat saying deferred start date. All right, it is deferred start date. That was actually the most common thing. Interestingly enough, the second most common thing though was earlier start date. So it looked like some employers actually moved up when the students started. They were like, oh, I guess people were like, oh, why spend the summer doing anything else other than working? So that's what we saw in our data. It's just a couple things from our data that were kind of neat. So yeah, and just as a plug, we might be doing another survey this year with MBA students, actually looking at people that are interning this summer. So I'm hoping that we'll launch that survey sometime this month, so look out for that.
Fantastic. Well, Nirma, this is fantastic. We have a few more minutes. I'd love to open it up to see if anyone with us has any additional questions they want to ask you.
Yeah,
so if you
absolutely.
have a question, you can either unmute your mic or put it in the chat.
And thanks to everyone for coming.
And we didn't even have you rap. I know that you rap in your class. Do you rap in all your classes or just some of them?
Nope, only in some of them. You
Okay.
got to pay for. No, I'm joking. You got to enroll in the course for that one.
All right, we have a question there.
Sonia asking, yeah, how do we navigate our power audit in a virtual setup? It's a great question. So I was just having this, I mentioned that I was speaking to this person that we're having in our course tomorrow as a guest speaker. And in case any of you are interested in attending, we have Scott Mills, who's the president of BET Networks, attending Power and Politics and Organizations as a guest tomorrow. So if any of you want to attend, just shoot me an email. I'm happy to give you the link. But we're having a conversation about this. And one of the things that's coming out of the data, and this is based on some research that Ethan Bernstein and some others have been doing, is how are networks changing in the time of COVID? And one of the things we're seeing is that people are tending to talk more to their strong ties at work. So the people that they're most likely to frequently interact with, I think something like 30%, their interactions have gone up 30% with those strong ties. And our interactions with our weak ties have gone down like 10%. And that's really noteworthy. It's not totally surprising, but it's noteworthy because our weak ties, that's where we get diverse information from. That's where innovation and creativity happens. That's the people that we go to for new promotion opportunities or job leads in other companies. So thinking about this in the virtual setup, Sonia, is important because we might be thinking that, oh, well, I'm still talking to people a lot at work, or I'm still interacting a lot with people at work. But what's happening is that we're leaning more on the people that we already know well, and we're not interacting with people that are outside of our networks as much. So you've got to do even more work in this kind of virtual world that we're living in to identify people that go beyond the immediate people that come to mind. So one of the things that Brian Lucas, who's a professor at Cornell, he's had a study that came out on how do we have more diverse representation in committees and groups and so forth. And it's such a simple solution. It's almost funny in a way. But the solution so you ask people to make a short list of the names of people that should come up for this position, essentially. So if I'm looking to, let's say, hire a new manager, I'd say, well, who do you think are all the good people that could be hired for this position? And then literally to get more diverse candidates, all you have to do is simply say, no, you need to work a little harder. Tell me more about other people that come to mind that would be good for this position. And I would almost encourage you to do a similar thing here in this virtual world, which is write down your context for this relational power audit, pause there, do the exercise, and be like, all right, well, who else is in my network? Who else could I potentially go to? And actually, it's going to be the people that don't come to mind immediately that you probably want to interact with more, because we're less likely to interact with our weak ties in this world. I've been doing something myself, just on a personal note, where we have these big nerdy academic conferences that used to obviously happen in person. So the one this year was actually supposed to happen in Philadelphia, which I was really looking forward to, but obviously with COVID, it's not happening. So there isn't as many opportunities for me to interact with people at other institutions who are in a similar position. So I've been organizing these virtual happy hours between people at different universities that have actually been really fun and really engaging. Like I'm learning about things that people are going through at Washington University, St. Louis, Texas A&M, UT Austin, HBS, and other schools. And it's just providing a nice mechanism for having these conversations that we used to just take for granted because we attend some of the same conferences. So just even looking for opportunities like that, I think can be valuable.
That's great. Sounds like you had a goal to network.
There's a narrative. It was actually a goal to do something at 3 p.m., which wasn't directly related to work, but was a little bit more social. But your goal is my social, I guess, Sam.
I'm sure it's well deserved and needed. All the great work you're doing.
Thank you.
Nirmo, it's so great to spend this time with you. I just can't thank you enough for coming and being a part of our specific career community. And just final question: where can people find you, either on social media or if they wanted to interact with you?
I used to do this whole thing called Twitter, but I just can't figure out how to type things in 140 characters or less. So do LinkedIn. I think that's actually the best thing. Also, I'm just so over the whole Twitter universe. It's just like such an echo chamber. I think LinkedIn's probably an echo chamber too, but at least I can post longer things that actually allow you to capture research properly. So LinkedIn is good, and email is always nice. And hopefully I'll see many of you in the fall. If you're still going to be at Wharton, it'll be great to see you in Power and Politics. So yeah, look out for that too.
All right. Well, thank you so much, and thank you everyone for joining us for this time.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sam. Powered up. See you later.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.